Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clements, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thank you for joining us during Black History Month for the Race and Justice Imperative. This is our summit featuring conversations with some of our nation's foremost black leaders. 44 years after the recognition of Black History Month, black Americans still experience systemic racism just about everywhere. Injustice, stereotyping in every facet of our society. Understanding the foundations of systemic racism and implicit bias and acknowledging their effects on black Americans and communities of color is one of the steps forward to try to generate change. We've curated today's conversations to help us understand this world, to understand race and racism, the conditions that perpetuate inequality, why empathy is so hard, why this moment could serve as a catalyst to help us unite and build a better nation. You're going to hear from a lineup of fantastic speakers from government as well as civil rights and social justice leaders. We even have somebody who appeared in a recent movie on this subject, and we're very glad to have that from Boise State. Joining me for today's sessions is Marty Johnson, my colleague from the newsroom. He's really cool, does a great job on all sorts of topics, but also this one. Marty covers politics, and I'm thrilled to welcome you. Marty, great to have you with us today. You're going to be on the spot.
I'm happy to be here.
You're excited, right?
Yeah, I am.
Not nervous?
No.
You're going to nail it. Before we get underway, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Alexion Pharmaceuticals, for making this event possible. A few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events, all together at The Hill Events, using the hashtag The Hill, hashtag The Hill BHM. We're broadcasting live, and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And I always laugh at this part. If you experience any trouble with our live stream, they say just refresh, and it will just magically fix things. Never works for me, but I hope it does for you. Our next guest is the first African American to serve as the Secretary of the Smithsonian since the institution's founding in 1846. Prior to this, he was founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. It is my favorite part of the Smithsonian portfolio. I won't tell the other parts, but it is an incredible place you should visit. It is the nation's largest, most comprehensive cultural destination devoted exclusively to exploring and documenting and showcasing the African American story and its impact on American and world history. I'm honored to welcome Lonnie G. Bunch, the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian. Lonnie, it's a great thing to talk to you, and I just want to let my listeners know that you have a dashboard that has American arts, culture, science, portraiture, just every dimension of our history, Native American history, and on and on and on in your portfolio. And right now, there's a lot of tension over how we tell that story. What are the parts of the dashboard that you think need to be shifted for the times we're in? And how do you get Americans to understand that that's part of what this is about?
I think it's important to recognize that the Smithsonian is one of the wonders of America. It's got expertise, as you said, in science, art, and culture. But it also is a place that's of value because of our expertise that we can give the public tools to grapple with the world they live in. I think it's crucially important to recognize that the Smithsonian is a place that's as much about today and tomorrow as it is about yesterday. And so whether it is looking at climate change through issues of science, or whether it's really looking at how we come together as a nation after we've been divided by race for so long, the Smithsonian has a role to play in helping a country find healing and a little bit of hope.
I'm going to ask you a tough question, my friend. When you first brought me into the National Museum of African American History and Culture, just before it opened, I realized there was a lot I did not know about this experience. I did not know about the Tulsa massacre. I did not know about elements of this history. I always thought of myself as an empathetic and a knowledgeable, well-read person, but there was so much I didn't know. If there's one time one way to describe the toxicity of this time, it's sort of the lack of empathy and understanding of walking in each other's shoes. I'm interested in how you, with the role that you have, can help people to kind of walk in each other's shoes, to have, broaden their aperture about our history and culture.
In many ways, what we've tried to do is to recognize that the way that we bring people together is to humanize history, is to not get lost in slavery, the migration, or even the Tulsa race riot, but to bring it to a level where you understand how humans have interacted. And basically, it's hard not to care about other people when you see yourselves in their story. And what was crucially important in building the African American Museum was to say that this was not a story by Black people for Black people. In essence, it was a story of a people's journey, but it was a nation story. And I think as long as we can help people see that these are issues that have shaped them, regardless of race, we find ways to bring people together. I have a great deal of faith that if we can help the American public remember not just what it wants to remember, but what it needs to remember, we can find that common space that'll help us really move forward as a nation.
You know, one of the places I'm involved with is Washington College. It was founded in 1782. It was actually the nation's first liberal arts college not derived from England. George Washington was on the board, etc. But there's a lot of the history, a lot about slavery, a lot about the African-American experience there that was not built in to the storytelling at school. And they've created something called the Asterisk Project. So rather than just, taking names off of things, they're adding asterisks with new parts of the history that have come in. Is that a healthy track forward in terms of helping people to broaden their aperture on what our historical experience is?
I think first we have to help people understand that history evolves, that our knowledge evolves, new data helps us see things in different ways, and that there's nothing wrong with a pruning of history. That doesn't mean you're erasing history, you're eliminating parts of the past. What you're doing is searching for a truer, more complete history. And I think being able to add new stories, new people that we make statues out of, new museums, new exhibitions, what that does is it allows us to recognize that America is much more complicated, but also much richer in terms of our history than we think. And that in essence, what we're really trying to do is help people realize that often we look as Americans for simple answers to complex questions, but history is ripe with complexity, nuance, and ambiguity. And if we can help Americans become comfortable with embracing ambiguity, understanding the complexity of the past, but also out of that complexity comes a sense of hope that the nation continues to evolve and move towards that more perfect union, then I think we make a major contribution to helping a country at a very difficult time.
Lonnie, one of the tugs of war going on right now is where America's responsibility, culpability, if you will, for the African-American slavery, let's just say slavery and enslaving people, whether that was when Westerners came here and made a presence in 1619, or whether that started with 1776, whether it started with 1787 and the signing of the Constitution. What is your best advice in terms of dealing with that kind of tug of war that's going on nationally and between legislators today?
I think it's important to realize that what you want is to understand a truer history. And you can't understand America without understanding slavery, its impact on our economic beginnings, but also on our social construction of who we are. And you can't understand America without understanding that the African American experience is this amazing lens. But on the one hand, it's a lens that talks about optimism, the importance of education, of helping America live up to its stated ideals. On the other hand, it's a story that says that America has always been a work in progress, been a place that has not always lived up to its founding documents. And the African American experience really challenges us as a nation to be true to our ideals. So I think it's always going to be a debate and a discussion, but I think it's crucially important to recognize that, in essence, we need to understand our history so that we can move forward as a nation collectively.
Let me ask you a fun question. You know, you've got the coolest portfolio of anybody I know in town. I know the Air and Space Museum is coming on, and of course we talked to the African American History and Culture Museum. We've got the Native American Museum. You've got the Portrait Gallery and all sorts of interesting stuff. The Museum of American History. Every one of these has its own controversies. But I'm really interested in, as you look at all of this stuff that you've got out there in the storytelling and engaging so many Americans to come in, what's the next thing? What's the Lonnie Bunch playground you want to build, add to the mix, or improve one of these great centers? I just love to know what's on your mind in that.
Well, I love the Smithsonian so much that before the pandemic, I would take walks to different museums and I would discover new things, or I would work with our scientists at the Astrophysical Observatory or down in Panama. So part of what I want is for people to understand what the Smithsonian has, that it's one of the great treasures of the world. and that I hope that we can find the right tension between tradition and innovation. I want people to come to the museums to see the Wright Flyer, the Ruby Slippers, the Greensboro Lunch Counter. But I also want people to really reach out to the Smithsonian via technology, that there are millions and millions of people who will never get to Washington. I want to make sure that we can virtually allow people to reap the benefits of understanding not just America, but our world and our universe because of what the Smithsonian has. So my goal is to not hide the Smithsonian's light under a bushel basket, to use technology to make sure that we reach out to the millions, and that ultimately we create an institution that has a contemporary resonance, that gives people tools, that helps them understand the challenges they face, help them understand the world we're living in today, and maybe by drawing on the Smithsonian, we can point us towards a better tomorrow.
You know, I keep reminding people, Lonnie, that the strength of the United States was being a melting pot. Lots of different cultures coming in, mixing from all over the world. And we're continue to be a melting pot, though some folks have tried to slow that down a little bit here and there. But I guess the question is, when I go over to the National Portrait Gallery, I go to the Air and Space Museum, go to some of these, I'm really pleased to see, a melting pot crowd, a diverse crowd of young people going to these museums. As you sort of deal with this question of how you kind of keep that stickiness there for exhibits and experiences so that it's not, and I hate to put it this term, but I'm going to, it's not, the white male experience. It's a broad set of other experiences. How do you train your teams? How do you inculcate that through an institution so they know that they're talking to every group and not just one narrow group that has had, a bit of a power position for a bit too long in this society?
I think it's framing it by saying what we're trying to do is give people understanding. And they can't have understanding if they don't look at things through multiple lenses. So part of it is drawing from scholarship. We are very fortunate over the last 50 years. There's been amazing scholarship that helps us understand our relationships, the complexity of our diversity. But it is also essential that we keep top of mind that our goal is to help people find a useful and usable history, to help people find ways to believe that change is possible, to believe that we can continue to move, as John Lewis said, towards that arc of justice. And so for me, it really is about holding people accountable to say that this has to be seen as everybody's Smithsonian, as everybody's story. Now that's tough sometimes because you have to make choices, but the reality is the more we embrace a more diverse understanding of who we are, a more complex understanding of who we are, the more likely we're able to deal with the challenges we face, because they're significant. But to recognize that we have come a long way from the time of Jim Crow segregation. But that doesn't mean we're at the promised land of total equality. And my goal is to help make sure that we move a country forward.
Well, Lonnie Bunch, 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian, I'm on the opinion side of things here, so I can say this. I really appreciate what you're doing to widen the aperture that people have on what their history, culture, and science ought to look like. And I really do think you've made magic over there already, and I know you're going to continue to do so. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. You're so kind, and I appreciate all the work that you do.
Our next speaker is the president and CEO of the Urban League, a historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization. Mark Morial, great to see you. I should mention one of the most popular mayors of New Orleans. It's great to see you again, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you. Thank you. And it was great to see Lonnie Bunch and hear him and his contributions.
Doesn't he have the best
to
job?
The Smithsonian.
He's got the best job. He's the curator.
He's got a great job. But I remember when he was hired to build the African American Museum, and it was a concept. There was a little bit of money. They didn't even have a piece of dirt. So his transformative leadership, and now to see him at the Smithsonian, I know some of the questions you asked were very important about how to widen this aperture, how the Smithsonian is a vehicle to research and tell the history of all Americans. So important.
Well, appreciate it, Mark, and I appreciate the role you're playing. I have not, only enjoyed conversations with you in the past, but lots of presidents of urban leagues in Chicago and in Los Angeles and Austin, various places. I'd love for our audience to understand a little bit about the role that urban leagues play in supporting and shepherding the interests of particularly black businesses, but urban businesses, civic engagement, but also what the problems are right now.
So let's paint a picture of the Urban League, which is unique. We are unique because on one hand, we're an advocacy organization. We do legislative advocacy. We do civil rights advocacy. On the other hand, we are a direct services enterprise, which means we provide a wide range of direct services to people through our network. You mentioned Los Angeles and Chicago, two cities where we have affiliates. We have a network of 90 affiliates across the nation. So we are doers of equity. We are implementers of strategies and policies and programs which are designed to address the persistent problems that we face. And we're a voice. So at the national level, we're a voice on Capitol Hill. We've got a robust agenda of legislative initiatives that we are working on that we want to see enacted this year, of course. And our programmatic work is being responsive to the COVID moment and beyond. So we are unique. I like to use the term sui generis, unique, one of a kind, incapable of being duplicated.
Let me ask you a little bit about the politics of the day. Just a couple of days ago, President Biden's team said it was going to prioritize small businesses, much smaller businesses in communities of color, because they were not getting, the level of PPE loans or PPP loans as many of the other companies that had out there. Is that working for your constituencies? Did they hear the call? Are they lined up?
Good question.
Are things happening?
So President Biden and this National Economic Council led by Brian Deese and others in the administration, in announcing what they announced on Monday, heard our commentary, heard the issues that we raised over the last several months about why the original PPP programs were bypassing small businesses and Black-owned businesses and owner-operated businesses. And so we pointed out some significant deficiencies in the design of the original PPP, which had great intent, but its design was flawed insofar of its ability to be able to address the needs of small businesses and the needs of African-American businesses. So the changes he's made, in effect, place a focus on businesses with less than 10 employees. 90% of Black businesses have one employee. The changes that he made will create an opportunity for minority depository institutions, Black banks, and Hispanic banks, and banks owned by people of color, and community development lenders to play a more significant role in determining who gets a forgivable PPP loan. So these changes, these priorities by President Biden are welcome, needed, and necessary. And I appreciate, most importantly, the way in which his team engaged with not only the National Urban League, but a number of advocates of minority businesses, Black-owned businesses, small businesses, to recalibrate this program. What I am certainly hopeful for is that it is the beginning of a larger commitment, a more significant commitment by the national government to stand up and provide better capital access flows to small businesses, Black-owned businesses, and other minority businesses.
Mark, I want to ask you a question. I'm probably going to get in trouble for this because I'm not sure I can frame it right, but why not do it on a show with everybody listening? But I'm wondering if we run a mistake in. Oftentimes we talk to business and say, hey, one of the big issues right now is minimum wage, and this affects the Black community and others, and you need to get that up to $15 or $11 or something. But when I look at the kind of broader questions of economic empowerment, you've got a lot of dynamic business owners and business leaders out there that may not get the capital they want. They're running different. I know these two women who run a company outside of D.C. called Furlough Cheesecake, and they created this when they were furloughed from government service, and now they're down at National Harbor. They're doing really, really well. They're innovative. I'm just wondering, you have a wide aperture when we talk about business engagement and empowerment, and it's not just about minimum wage. I know minimum wage is part of the story, but do you think we're making a mistake of typecasting just in that area? Do we need to broaden our discussion about what economic engagement means?
There's no question it needs to be broadened, but minimum wage is one thing that is in the absolute control of public policy. The minimum wage is set by the Congress. The notion of a national minimum wage has been present since the 1930s, I believe. The notion that Americans who work ought to be able to make a wage that is dignified and decent. But you are so right that that alone is not going to solve the racial income or the racial wealth gap. But here's what's important. Most of the people, a large percentage, I should say, of people who earn or have minimum wage jobs, they are women under the age of 40, many raising children. So we've got to understand the human element, not just the economic theory, not just sort of these arguments about whether it's burdensome. And then we ought to be aware of the reality. Look, almost half the states, about half the states, they haven't waited for the federal government to adjust their minimum wage. We have minimum wage levels higher than the national minimum wage, I think, in some 25 states. But that's not the best way to do economic policy, to have this patchwork of minimum wage rules and laws all across the nation. What we've said historically is let's be consistent and set a basic floor. And I think we need to be talking in terms of not a minimum wage, but a living wage. And for people to earn more money is also a stimulus to the economy. It's a stimulus because most of the money that folks earn who make a minimum wage or who make lower wages, they're going to spend that on food, clothing, shelter. They're gonna plow it back into the economy, and that's going to have a positive effect on economic growth. So, but the premise of your question, is it enough? It is not enough, but it's something that Congress can absolutely control.
Thank you for that, my friend. We're out of time. Barbara Lee's coming, but I got to squeeze in one last thing. So give me a fast frame. I love your tweets, and you're tweeting about the International Civil Rights Center and going to this, the site of the February 1, 1960 whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. I want to know, how did that feel? What should people who are not familiar with that experience, just give us a sense of that moment. And because you tweeted about it, found it very powerful, but real short form because we got to move to Congresswoman
I
Lee.
went to the site of the new museum about 2 years ago, and the longtime director, Amelia Parker, just passed at that site. But I think if people can imagine the indignity of having money in your pocket and not being able to eat at a lunch counter in a five and dime store is what Woolworth was called in the day, and how that makes people feel. As a boy, I'll say, little boy, we would go to Sears. And when we'd go to Sears store with my mother, she would never allow us to use the segregated bathroom at Sears store. She'd say, we're not using this bathroom. You have to hold it till we get home. Because they were not going to bow to the indignity of segregation.
Well, Mark Morial, President and CEO of the Urban League, former mayor of New Orleans, good friend. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thanks for having me. Continue to do what you're doing. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
And our next conversation is going to be led by Marty. Take it away, Marty.
Thanks, Steve. Our next guest is Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California. She has spent decades in public service advocating for legislative action to end poverty across the nation. She's the only black woman on the House Democratic leadership team this session of Congress, serving as co-chair of the powerful Policy and Steering Committee. She also sits on the House Budget and House Appropriations Committee. Congresswoman Lee, thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be with you. Thank you.
So yesterday, the Congressional Black Caucus rolled out its 100-day plan. And part of that plan includes a new domestic policy leadership team, which you and Senator Cory Booker are co-chairing. So what is, when it comes to that leadership team, what is your goal in advancing legislation this session of Congress that really benefits Black Americans?
Sure, and thank you very much for having me with you. And I think part of what we're excited about is that finally we have an administration who has as one of its buckets in terms of policy orientation, the issue of racial justice and racial equity. And so Senator Booker, myself, our great chair, Joyce Beatty, we put together this team to really work with Susan Rice, who chairs the Domestic Council, to look at all of the issues. This is a whole of government approach as it relates to systemic racism, structural racism, and how we really begin to dismantle those aspects of our federal policies. This is on all fronts, and then move forward with racial equity and racial justice is central to everything that we do.
And part of, I'm sure the bills that are high on your list include the George Floyd Injustice and Policing Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, both bills that passed the House last session but weren't able to even make it to the floor of the Senate for a vote. How crucial is it for those bills to get through, at least to a vote on the Senate floor this session?
Extremely important. And I just want to take a moment to salute Congresswoman Karen Bass, who is the lead sponsor of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This bill, we got it through the House last year, and we're going to work, and hopefully soon it will be scheduled to once again be actually voted on in the House sooner rather than later. And so I'm confident that because of the brutal the brutal murders of Mr. Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the rest of the country actually witnessing what we've always known and experienced throughout our history here in America is that police misconduct and police reform is absolutely necessary if there will truly be a just criminal justice system. And so we and Congresswoman Bass and the Congressional Black Caucus has built support across caucus lines, and we should be moving that bill forward very shortly. Also on the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that's imperative. We see now states that are engaging in putting forth more voter suppression efforts to further erode our voting rights. And so this bill will be coming. We're not sure exactly when it will be scheduled, but this is extremely fundamental to our democracy. And again, the Congressional Black Caucus is leading. And we certainly know that the environment that we find ourselves in requires us to be very, aggressive in pushing forth this bill, because these states are moving very quickly as a result of the expansion of the voting of people who vote now, younger people, people of color, our seniors, the coalitions that are being put together. That's a threat to others, to mainly Republicans. And so now these states are coming down hard on voter suppression efforts. So we have to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act very soon.
And when it comes to the question of social justice and racial justice, we actually have an audience question for you.
Sure.
My question for the panelists is why people talk about social justice and not economic justice?
Why do people talk about social justice and not economic justice? Right. We need to talk about, and I'm always saying we've got to talk about social, economic, and racial justice. I mean, racial justice, economic justice, social justice intersect, especially if you're an African American. And so some people, maybe not have that complete perspective in terms of economic justice and how social justice, economic justice, how they intersect with racial justice. Because again, as an African American, we know how important racial justice is, how important economic justice is, and how important social justice is. So we have to talk about the three together.
And to that point, one of the big things when it comes to racial justice is the COVID-19 response from the federal government. And President Biden has rolled out this national strategy. But what are you hearing from your constituents, from your communities of color, about how resources and vaccine distribution have been going there?
Sure, and that's one thing that we've witnessed throughout the country. Another manifestation of systemic racism in our healthcare system because of the disproportionate rates of transmission and deaths in the African American community and other communities of color. And so it's the same thing in California. Disproportionate vaccine distribution. We're trying to get that right. Finally, we have FEMA established a vaccination distribution and vaccination site at the Oakland Coliseum, which is the location where African American and Latinx communities can access, and low-income communities. And this partnership seems to be working well in my district, even though we've had some bumps in the road. But overall, myself and the Congressional Black Caucus, Hispanic Caucus, Asian Pacific American Caucus, and our two Native American women, we put forth the COVID Community Care Act, which really lays out the roadmap for how we address testing, contact tracing, and vaccine distribution in medically underserved and communities of color. I do have to say that we were able in this last survival package to get in $2.8 billion for targeted communities, which was a very important first step. And we were able to put in $300 million. And again, that's as a result of us working together with Speaker Pelosi's leadership and our committee chairs to be able to get in $300 million for vaccine distribution, specifically targeted to underserved communities. In this next bill, in the $1.9 trillion package, we also have additional strategies and funding. We have to hire people from our communities because so much of what we're hearing in my community and throughout the country is that historically we have an understanding of how systemic racism has worked to our detriment in terms of the Tuskegee experiment, in terms of being used as guinea pigs for surgeries and for medications that really killed us in many respects. And so we're reticent and we're reluctant. And so with the vaccine, we have to have, because we know this is a matter of life and death, we have to have trusted messengers who can be hired from our community, trained to deliver these public health messages. So we put resources in just for that purpose, because we know this is truly a matter of life and death.
Well, Congresswoman, thanks so much for taking the time to come on here and talk about all the things that we're doing and all the things that still need to happen. So we appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Glad to be with you.
Well, it's over. Never mind.
Did you want to say something?
Oh yeah, I was going to ask Congresswoman Lisa. Hey, Congresswoman Lisa, Steve Clements from the Hill. Also, I told Marty that I'll be his Ed McMahon to his Johnny Carson, and he is just of a different generation and didn't get that. So I'm the sidekick here. But I wanted to ask you one other thing. Every administration has a blind spot, and I respect and just know your work for so long on this. And there have been Democratic administrations as well as Republican administrations that have not solved the overall problem of systemic racism in this country. And I guess my question is the Biden administration, from your perspective, doing all that's needed right now? Are there blind spots? What do you think is the next horizon of things to push even this administration further than it's gone so far?
Sure, Steve. And I don't think they're blind spots. I think that by them coming out very quickly with regard to their priorities in terms of racial equity and racial justice tells me that that's a priority for them. We have to continue to push to have transformative change in our policies in our federal government. And a couple of things that, of course, myself, Congresswoman Jackson Lee are really pushing for, as well as others, is the establishment of a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission, which 40 other countries have always done after genocides, crimes against humanity, and slavery. We've never had that, so that the public can understand the connection between 401 years ago and the Middle Passage and the enslavement of Africans and systemic racism, and why they see Mr. George Floyd being killed brutally by the police, or why they witnessed the disparities in COVID as it relates to the transmission and deaths of relating to the virus, or why there's this huge wealth gap or why the disproportionate rates of African Americans are incarcerated to our population. You know, the whys, the systemic racism. And a lot of people are just becoming aware of white supremacy and systemic racism, but they don't understand that we've made a lot of progress since 401 years ago, but we still have to crack these chains of slavery and move forward. And so we have to have that moment where we educate the public about the roots of systemic racism, because you hear so many people now talking about healing and moving forward.
Yeah.
Well, you can't heal until we address the truth. So we have to have this moment of a commission to establish that and move forward to develop, study and develop reparations. And so we're working with the Biden administration to explain and put this in as part of their strategies as it relates to racial equity and racial justice, because we have to have something that's sustainable and truly transformative in terms of the reorganizing of how we address racial justice.
Marty and I just got told we got an extra couple of minutes, so it'd be great. So we're going to steal them from you. But I'm going to just ask you another question and then go to Marty real quick. You know, I think you and I talked about this a long time ago, and there's this need. The reason we're doing this show is not to talk, preach to the choir, right? We're not trying to preach to the choir today. We're trying to sort of talk broadly about experience, empathy, why systemic racism is so stubbornly resilient. I know your constituency, and I know that you talk to folks that are not necessarily in this. What have been the best practices that you've deployed in your conversations with people who do not understand this experience? I'd love to kind of hear, Barbara Lee's, toolkit, if you will, on how you bring people over who have not been part of this conversation into it, so they now feel part of the, action plan, if you will.
Sure, thank you for that. And I have a very enlightened constituency. And my constituency, though, still, after the horrific murder of Mr. Floyd, called me, many people, many white progressives, actually. So what are we seeing here? After the visuals of Black people dying disproportionately from COVID-19, they call me and say, what are we seeing here? What is this about? And I have to explain to them that this is about a system of government that enslaved Africans that has made, we've had progress in terms of our desegregation efforts. Mm-hmm. But remember, we had Black codes, we had segregation, we had Jim Crow, we had lynchings. The last lynching was only, 1960. We've had a series of structural racism built into America. And that's part of its DNA since 401 years ago. So I have to explain the trajectory and how and why systemic racism and structural racism and white supremacy is alive and well, and why we have to do things differently. And I think January 6th just highlighted it. Several people called me and said, my God, what's happening? What I said, look, Black people have known what domestic terrorism for all of our lives here. We know what white supremacy is, and then I have to break it down and explain. Mm-hmm. So that's why this commission is so important, so we can explain these issues, so we can talk about the historical context, because otherwise people just keep spinning their wheels and don't really understand why in a country that's supposed to be a country of liberty and justice for all, that we still have these issues. Finally, I'll say I listened to Mark Morial and his story about going to Sears. Well, I share my stories. My mother, I almost didn't get into this world because they wouldn't admit my mother, because she was Black, into the hospital and she needed a C-section. After a long story, but finally they admitted her, but they left her with no care and she almost died. And so they had to rush her in to the emergency room, and it was too late for a C-section, and they had to deliver me using forceps. My mother I almost didn't breathe coming out. Wow. And my mother almost died during childbirth. Wow. And so these are stories that every Black person has. And so I try to share these stories about my personal life so they can kind of understand why we have to do something different in this country.
Well, I'm really, really glad you're telling those stories. It's important. I know sometimes it's very hard to do that. So on behalf of Marty and myself, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, thank you. Please come back. And it's really important to do what you're doing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, anytime. Thank you all for doing this.
How has systemic racism and stereotyping led to continued injustice in society over time? And what are the biggest challenges facing the erasure of those biases? To answer these questions and more, we are joined by experts in racial justice and civil rights law. Latifah Simon is the president of Akhenaten Foundation, which works to end structural racism. Back in 2003, she was the youngest MacArthur Genius Grant recipient for her work helping break the cycle of poverty, violence, and incarceration. Deidre Jackson is the national director of the Black Youth Project 100, a national organization of Black youth activists focused on justice and freedom for all Black people. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question is for Latifah. You worked with now Vice President Kamala Harris back when she was in the California system. What do you think it means for people to see a Black vice president of the country?
Sure. In working within District Attorney Harris, prior to working with her, my job was to be a disruptor and organizer of fighting against systems that didn't work for people that looked like me and that I cared about. I was a young executive director of a grassroots movement organization. And when then DA Harris hired me, she was clear that she was a Black woman coming into a system that was not made for her to lead it, and that we could slowly chip away at a broken system by developing programs that challenged drug war laws. Now, we mentioned Greensboro earlier in the program, and I think about that. It has been 60 years, almost 61 years since those brave movement builders did civil disobedience in that Woolworth. Very, very clear that it would take the action of freedom fighters to adjust, to reform a system, a nation that had not dealt with its original sin. Their mothers and fathers could not go and eat in a public institution. 60 years later, you have a Black woman walking into the White House, not as a guest, but as a second in command of the free world. Politicians are not prophets. We get an opportunity with this administration to push and to organize and hold them accountable to the values that they've announced that they'll hold dear. I love Vice President Harris. She was a dear mentor to me, but she has also been clear that it is our job on the ground to push the administration to continuously lift up the rights of real people, do the right thing, and ensure that those words that are listed on the Statue of Liberty hold true. So we still have a lot of organizing to do.
And the first civil rights movement you brought up 60 years ago, the freedom fighters, those were young people, those were college students who decided that they want to make a difference. They saw a change that they knew they could make. Deidre, you founded a Dream Defenders chapter back when you were in college. How do you, have you seen any change about organizing and working with young people when you did that, when you first started and to now?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I was a grad student in FIU down in Miami, and I was attending school at the same time that Trayvon Martin and the non-indictment of George Zimmerman was happening. So I was in Florida, and just like many people my age, we were on social media watching what was happening. And I got connected to folks in Dream Defenders and immediately joined and began organizing from there. I moved to North Carolina and immediately began organizing across the state, working specifically with young Black students. North Carolina has more historically Black institutions for higher learning. I'm an HBC alum of Cheyney University. And so it was critical for me to be able to organize across the state for many different issues that Black students at different schools, not just at the HBCUs, but also at the predominantly white institutions were facing in terms of institutional racism and harassment by the campus police.
And when it comes to young people, obviously, not only are they active in organizing in grassroots foundations, they're also increasingly important at the ballot box, at the polls. And we saw in Georgia how young Black voters made a difference. So when working with young people, and this is for both of you, what do you center on when it comes to, driving them to the polls and importance of voting?
Go ahead, sister, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that young people recognize and see on multiple levels the intersections of what we are experiencing. Being Black, being a woman, being poor, being queer, and all of the ways that we are in proximity to oppression, and not in the proximity of power. We have different ways of viewing what is happening around us, and in developing strategies that make the most sense for those that are sitting at the margins of our community. So Black people in this country historically have sat at the margins in many different ways. And even within our Black communities, there are folk that are also more at the margins. And so how do we bring the stories and solutions of what's happening with them into the work that we are doing, so that those folks can be centered, we can continue to be centered in what we're doing, and that we have fuller solutions and fuller strategies of getting at what we're trying to do. Voting is one way. It is a tool that we use, and it is very important. And there's many other ways that we want to really be in building power to be able to make decisions over our lives.
That's right.
And then
when you speak, it's encouraging, and also understanding that the movement leaders of today will be making the decisions for the nation and our well-being, in years to come. Young people just don't go to the polls. There has been a very sophisticated movement in this country for decades to take back power, or to take power. We actually see more Black young mayors all over the country, in cities like Baltimore, recently Stockton, San Francisco. These are Black folks who were raised in public housing and raised by single mothers, who were trained not only as organizers, but as young academics and policymakers, insistent that we can march and organize and disrupt, but until we have the power at the dais to make decisions that deeply affect the people that we love most, we are going to continue to beg rogue politicians to shift and change the dynamics of our communities. So the work that BYP 100 is doing and Dream Defenders are doing, they are literally laying down a democratic framework that asks us to be not only our best, but to live up to what has been oftentimes a failed promise to young Black and brown people in this country. They have organized tens of thousands of young people per city all over the country to demand that their cities, that their counties, and that their states look different. So thank you, sister, for your work.
Thank you.
Of course, and I think the underlying topic of what we've talked about not only is equality, but equity. And I think when we talk about advancing equity within communities, I think that's where divisions start to happen and people don't understand as much. So how would you, who work to organize Black people and work for the betterment of Black Americans, how would you define, or what does equity look like to you? And then what do you think is important for people to know when it comes to social justice?
Want to take it?
No, you go.
And I'll respond after.
Okay. So for me in BYP 100, something that is in our mission is that we fight for Black liberation and freedom. And for me, what that looks like is having permanently organized communities. We need to be able, especially what the pandemic has taught us, is that we need the people that are closest to us in order to get to the safety that we want, to get to the better well-being of our cities, and also to try to fight against the rapid gentrification that is pushing Black people out of their homes and into wherever, because we also have this economic disaster that we're facing with the increase of job loss and young Black people, right? We have the most student debt, and we end up having to do jobs that pay the least. And so our economic situation, to say the least, for young people is not set up for us to really succeed. And so the strategies that we're trying to develop, and in thinking about the liberation and freedom that we dream of, how can we be in more conversations and in more discussions about building power and about making decisions, but also what does it mean to be safe? And what does it mean to be organized in our communities? We need people to know that they can go to their city councilmen and their mayors and advocate for something, and that we also need to be able to learn to know how to how to get a stop sign on our streets. And so it's the small, slow work that needs to happen in order to really achieve even something past equity. There's something more on the other side of this. And I think equity serves its purpose, and it isn't the North Star. It has never been the North Star, right? And so what we are trying to do is something different. And we are in the place of really trying to reconcile with the folks that are really making decisions over our lives, including our safety. And this big push over the summer was around defunding the police. It was what we were calling for. It was what young Black people across this country were yelling. And what that means is not just about getting rid of the police so that we can have chaos. It's actually about what are some ways that we already keep each other safe that don't involve the police. And with the increases of their budgets and the decreasing of, we have climate disaster. I mean, look at Texas, and their police just got a huge budget. And so we're really in the business of intervening and interrogating what the decision makers really see as valuable, and trying to make people see that our communities are the most valuable things we have.
I think those examples are extremely important. And if I could just, we're at time?
Yeah, just quickly.
Oh, well, again, hopefully in this moment, representing philanthropy, now I'm on the other side of the table, our job is to fund movement leaders. If you had an opportunity to fund a young Rosa Parks and, hundreds of young college students to advance what we think is possible, not only in terms of integration, but a free society that moves beyond equity, we would do that. Why aren't we funding movement leaders and organizations like BYP 100 to express and also to activate what racial healing could look like beyond this moment? Last thing, our hero, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, talked about the power of recognizing this moment and brought up HR 40. We have to meet this moment by acknowledging the original sin of this nation and address the wrongs and make it right. This is the apex moment. We have the leadership, we have young people on the ground, we have philanthropy, hopefully here to be more courageous, to fund the civil and human rights movement of 2021. We can and we will heal this nation if we listen to the power, righteousness, and pragmatic approach to shift and change and meet it with a liberation format. We have what we need to reach a new day in this country.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Back to you, Steve.
Congresswoman Maxine Waters is considered by many to be one of the most powerful women in American politics today. She's also made history as the first woman and first African-American chair of the House Financial Services Committee. Congresswoman Waters, great to see you. Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
No, it's great to see you again. We have been focused today on, how we not make this, a day, a trip through, Black History Month, where we check off the box, talk about these, issues of systemic racism and discrimination. What we're trying to do is talk about really moving the needles and making progress in this time, which I know you're very committed to. But I want to ask you and start by focusing on some of the things you pointed out via Twitter and other places about your concerns about the rise of white supremacist movements, terrorism, radicalism under the era of President Trump, and whether or not you're beginning to feel better about where we're now. But what are your ongoing concerns about the security of this country and the rise of white supremacist movements?
Well, thank you so very much. And, I really appreciate the question because, now that we have this country and maybe this world focused on what happened here in Washington, D.C., January 6th, where our Capitol was invaded by insurrectionists, perhaps we can get more real interest in people understanding how big this movement is of white supremacists, including everything from the Proud Boys to the Oath Keepers to QAnon, et cetera, and understanding more about what they do and whom they are and what danger they present for, all of us. And so with this focus, this discussion, I think makes good sense. Legislators who were absolutely targeted at risk, thinking more about public policy. This country has a long history of domestic terrorism. Don't forget, I'm a descendant of slaves and, of course, of all of the lynchings that took place in this country, with perhaps over 5,000 Black people having been lynched prior to, the big movement for separation in this country. So let me just say that we must recognize it. We must call it for what it is. We must have laws specifically dedicated to dealing with domestic terrorism. And we must, in every way that we can, help to educate people about what it is, what we can do. It must be talked about in our schools at every level of education, in our elementary schools, in our colleges and universities. And we must do everything that we can to deal with what now is a growing movement with all of these social media platforms recruiting and financing these movements.
Congressman Waters, how much do you think the current Republican Party is dependent on I hate to put it this way, the QAnon crowd, the conspiracy theory crowd, the white supremacist crowd? How much, as you look at it, I know you talk to legislators across the aisle, and we saw this interesting thing where when there was a blind ballot, Liz Cheney was held in place. If there's not a blind ballot, you don't see that same sort of stance on some of these things. So I'm just sort of interested in how, when you talk to your colleagues, are they scared of their base, of President Trump's base?
Well, my colleagues don't really talk about that. As a matter of fact, they keep their mouths closed, but their actions speak louder than words. They're obviously intimidated by them. They're afraid of them, led by the President of the United States of America, but they certainly know for sure whom they are and what they do. But no, you don't get a lot of conversation from them about how terrible it is. As a matter of fact, they should be more vocal now and absolutely disengaging themselves in any way from any of them and not being aligned with them, not turning a blind eye to them. They know who many of them are in their districts, but they do not admit it. As a matter of fact, they kowtower to them. And so, no, they don't talk about it. And we've got to keep bringing it out in the open. They are more prepared to align themselves with the President of the United States, who's aligned with these domestic terrorists, than they are for protecting democracy and this country and the Constitution of the United States of America. And that is what's so amazing to me. I never thought I would see that, because Republicans, for the most part, being more conservative, have always held out that they were more patriotic than anybody else. And they've waved this flag, the same flag that they had when they invaded the capital of the United States, the same flag that they claim to honor and love and protect, was seen in the midst of this invasion of our capital, using it to beat up on people and to basically attack our Capitol Police, et cetera. And so they don't talk about it, but they know it exists. And I consider them complacent because they don't admit it.
Now, Congresswoman, a lot of conservative TV showed pictures of you after the debacle of children being separated from their parents at the border and others, and you said, we can't let that administration be comfortable just thinking this is status quo. And there was an effort to equate your comments about that to the January 6th insurrection. I'd love to give you a chance to respond to those people who tried to equate what you were saying at that moment to what happened with the insurrection on January 6th?
You're absolutely correct. I was in a rally that was organized by parts of my community, Westchester, combined with Santa Monica and Culver City and those areas. These were some nonprofits, these were moms, these were homeowner association, and they all came in preparation for their trip to go to the border to take toys and other kinds of useful things to the children. And so in this rally, I joined with some of the restaurateurs who had already started a movement to let members of the administration, the Trump administration, know that they should be ashamed of themselves for supporting that policy and that they were not welcome in their restaurants. And so I took off on that theme and I basically told them, you're not welcome anywhere because of the Cajun of these children. And of course, they attempted to use that to say this was synonymous with what the president was saying. Well, I want to tell you, many people did not buy that. They saw the difference. They know that I never even talked about attacking anybody. They never talked about fight and charge on anything or anybody. And so even Jake Tapper, one of the finest journalists that we have, defended me and talked about, no, that's not the same. And you can't try and somehow hide what the president did, behind saying, look at the other people. They're doing the same thing. Look at Maxine Waters. It didn't work, and it certainly doesn't bother me because we know that it is not true for them to equate my advocacy for the children that are in cages still, but this administration is doing a great job of connecting many of them with their parents now. I just saw that information today. And so, yes, they attempted it, but it doesn't work, and it doesn't bother me.
I really appreciate you speaking to that. I think it's very important. Let me just ask you finally a kind of big topic question. As we talk today about, moving the needle on this, what we're really talking about is, there hasn't been trust across society. There hasn't been fairness, hasn't been equity. There's been systemic racism. People haven't walked in each other's shoes. I am really interested when we talk about trying to restore trust and fairness, what are some of the best pathways you would suggest as we go into this and try to get people to understand what it is like to be the descendant of people who were slaves, to the descendant of people who had redlining against them, the descendant of people who in this COVID crisis are bearing the burden of this much more. There's a trust deficit out there, and I know you're a strategist. So share with us the strategy to try to get back to some restoration of trust and fairness in this society.
Well, I'd like to try and attempt to do that. But before attempting to do that, let me tell you the disinformation and the way that Bannon talks about race and the way that the president has talked about it, they exacerbate these feelings of distrust. And they are talking about taking back our country. It's talking about the Jews shall not replace us. And so they fan the flames of the fire constantly. And they have a big platform from which they do it, which makes it very difficult to do exactly what you're talking about. People start to look over their shoulder even more. And, African Americans are saying, well, can I trust all white people? Can I trust the physicians at the hospital? Can I trust the teachers? Can I trust? And I mean, I've heard more of that now than even I've heard, during my entire career. So I think that number one, and this is, the kind of lesson that, people may not pay a lot of attention to, but what parents and families do in the rearing of their children, and they're engaging with them on the questions of our society and about respect for others, et cetera, and the acceptance of other cultures, and is so very important. I just read a story about a mother and a child, and the little girl purchasing a doll, and I think she was trying to purchase maybe a second doll. I don't know. I can't remember those details. But when they went to the store and the little girl, who was white and the mother was white, picked out a brown skinned doll, the sales clerk said, "Are you sure you want that doll?" And the mother, the little girl said, "Yes, I like her." And the mother had to, look at the sales lady strangely and try and send signals that she should not be trying to discourage her from buying that doll. But this kinds of things go on in everyday life. And it's been going on in different ways, in so many ways. And I'm not simply talking about the big discriminatory ways, the big racism of, redlining or predatory lending and housing and all of that. I'm talking about the everyday contact. So one of the things I would recommend is for the many whites who really are just absolutely opposed to what they see in these domestic terrorists and these racists, pay attention to what's going on in the family and the neighborhoods, the neighborhood councils, when people get together. The churches are still separate. On Sunday, you got the white churches, you got the black churches. There are few that are integrated, but not many. And so what are the ministers doing who have the power to influence so many parishioners? And so many people have to take a part in determining and absolutely coming to grips with, we all play a role in this. And I want our schools to have Black history, starting in our elementary grades, so that, people understand not only the history of the country, but what has happened to disenfranchise and to, create this separation. So that's all very important. And then those of us who are considered in positions of power, we've got to use our power to do everything that we can public policy wise to bring this to the fore. For example, being the first woman and the first African American to become the chair of the powerful Financial Services Committee, I created a subcommittee on diversity and inclusion so that interacting with the financial sector of our society, I can talk with them about who are you hiring? What are the opportunities for upward mobility? Do you have a department on diversity and inclusion? Do you have someone that reports to you about what kind of advances you're making? And that is beginning to work out pretty well with many of our banks and with Wall Street that are coming up with diversity and inclusion departments and individuals. So I think those of us who have the ability, because we have some positions of power and influence, should use that instead of simply seeking out perks for ourselves and falling into the tradition of doing things the way that they're always done. We have to break out from that, and we have to use our positions to open up these opportunities. And so when we become elected officials, this has to be a part of our ongoing agenda, dealing with our town hall meetings, dealing with our constituents, and all that we can while we have these powers, centers of influence to help people to understand exactly what is going on and exactly what could make for a better world for all of us. Now, I want to just share something with you. There's this book called The Devil You Know by a very, very
Show it up a
competent-
little bit more.
Okay.
There you go.
This
Yeah, there
is
you go.
by
Yep.
Charles Blow.
Charles Blow, my friend.
Yeah. Well, he's one of the, writers for the New York Times.
Yeah.
And he's written, several books, but this is his latest one, The Devil You Know. And it discusses, what happened in this country with migration from the South and Blacks, going north, et cetera. And he talks about power and how to amass power. And it's very interesting that he has, experienced what he's experienced. He's seen what he has seen in all of the people who have tried so hard to deal with these kinds of issues. He's now advocating for African Americans to take a look at moving back south and taking over the entire southern region, because you have places like Jackson, Mississippi, where the majority in that city are Black. You have other places in South Carolina where the majority now are Blacks, and increasingly you have Black mayors and elected officials. And he's thinking that if you ever want to really have equality in the United States Senate, for example, sending 2 senators from several of the states, or all of the states in the Deep South, would certainly create influence and power. And he's talking about how you amass power, given everything that we've gone through, everything that we've experienced. If we want to exercise power, power is what corrects, the deficiency in these relationships. So this is very interesting. And I've read it once, I'm going to read it twice. I've talked to him about it. And I'm going to help put together some of the mayors of the South and see what they think about it.
We'll do a show with Charles, whom I know, and you, if you want. We'll call him up, say, hey, let's kind of take this on the road.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me ask you, my team is going to get so upset with you, but I'm going to ask one last question of you, Congresswoman.
Yes.
Joe Biden spoke about systemic racism in his State of the Union address. You are chair of the powerful House Financial Services Committee. Your constituent, Amanda Gorman, stole the show, kind of created this, And so I guess my question to you, just to leave real quickly, is if we come back, I want to talk to you a lot more than, just every 4 years, but if we come back in 4 years, do you feel optimistic that this thing that we're just kind of going on, and this is going to still be, do you think we will have moved some of the tectonics of this debate significantly, given where, are you optimistic or are you cynical?
Well, I have to tell you this. I am the eternal optimist, and I have to be in the work that I do, knowing what I know and having experienced what I've experienced. In order to do this work, I've got to believe that it makes a difference somehow. And no matter how small it is, that every day I must wake up, believing that I and others can do something to make things better. So I'm always optimistic in spite of the disappointments that I may confront. I go to bed at night, and oftentimes I am thoroughly disgusted at what I experienced that day. But a good night's sleep, I wake up the next morning ready to go and thinking I'm going to do something to help create change today. And so I'm an optimist.
Well, Representative Maxine Waters, chair of the House Financial Services Committee, I want to talk to you both about this issue. I want to have you back and talk about banking and finance and FICO scores and all that, which we get into. Real pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it, and I'm so pleased that you're going to do something with Charles Blow and I, okay?
Excellent. We'll do that. Well, that brings us to the end of our first session today. A big thank you to Alexion Pharmaceuticals for its support of this program, and to all of you in the audience for joining us for this first hour. We're not done yet. Stretch your legs, check your email, grab a bite to head out and eat. I'm probably going to go run around the block and eat some celery or something. It's about time. We're going to be back at 1:30 p.m. with my colleague Marty. We'll be speaking with Martin Luther King III, changemaker Van Jones, Professor Michael Eric Dyson, powerful, for discussions on rebuilding societal structures for equity. I'm Steve Clemens, and he's Marty. We'll see you soon.